Greetings. Hello, my name is Dana Peterson, and I am the Chief Economist at the Conference Board. I'm going to be discussing how we can close racial inequality gaps in America. Well, let's first take a look at how much these gaps are costing us. Some of the gaps include wages, education, home ownership, and also business access to capital. And all of these gaps contribute to the overall wealth gap that we see between Black Americans and their peers in America. We did a study and we found out that if we added up these gaps over the last 20 years, it would be equivalent to $16 trillion. That's right, $16 trillion, which is an astounding number. Let's look at how we came up with this number. Let's talk about the racial wage gap. If we looked at the amount of money that white Americans, in particular white males, are making relative to their cohorts, the difference is $6.8 trillion over the last 20 years. And if we made the comparison between white males and Black Americans, then that difference would be $2.7 trillion over the last 20 years, or a loss of 2/10 of GDP each year that Black Americans aren't generating for the economy. Let's take a look at the next gap, access to higher education. So if we looked at the difference between the number of people, in particular white persons who are earning college degrees versus Black persons, we'd see a pretty significant gap. And if we added up the lifetime income that Black Americans are missing out of over a 20-year period, well, that we saw over the last 20 years, then it would be equivalent to anywhere from 90 to $113 billion, which is just astounding. Imagine what you can do with that amount of money in terms of investing in your families and investing in your communities. Another gap is with respect to housing credit access. When we look at the number of Black households that could have been created if they had access to housing, it would have equated to 770,000 Black homeowners. Imagine if each of those Black homeowners then bought a car or bought furniture or appliances or lawn care equipment for those homes. We would have added up roughly $218 billion in GDP over that time period of 20 years. So this is, again, really astounding numbers. And then finally, if we look at fair and equitable lending for Black entrepreneurs, roughly $13 trillion in business revenue was not created over the last 20 years because Black businesses either did not have money or access to credit to keep their doors open, or they were never able to create those businesses at all. Another way of looking at it is thinking about how many jobs were not created. Roughly 6 million jobs a year were not created because Black entrepreneurs did not have access to credit and financing. The interesting thing is that when we look at the different points of financing, Black entrepreneurs are actually pretty equal in terms of their ability, and actually slightly better in terms of their ability of gaining or collecting funds in early stages of financing, such as gaining money from friends and family or from their own personal savings. However, when you look at subsequent rounds of financing, they trail behind their white counterparts, including access to capital from banks, venture capitalists, capital markets, angel investors. Indeed, a study by the Small Business Association revealed that for Black Americans or Black entrepreneurs, they are the most likely group to be denied access to funding at every level of financing, whether they are asking for credit cards, money from angel investors, money from friends and family, or even from banking and credit unions. They are the most likely to say that they did not receive the amount of funding that they requested. Now, some of this may have to do with things like credit scores, but again, many of these people are already successful and already very driven and have already raised their own capital from amongst their own sources. So there's got to be something else here. So what if we close all of these gaps? The wage gap, education, housing, and also access to financing. Well, we could generate almost $5 trillion through the next 5 years in terms of GDP, or that's roughly a half percentage of GDP growth every year. if we think about how quickly the US economy was growing before the pandemic, the US is growing about 2.5%. If we could add another 0.5%, that's 3% growth. That's really outstanding growth. And that would be achieved just by getting rid of these gaps between what African Americans and Black Americans in the US are facing in terms of generating wealth versus their white counterparts. So, what can governments, individuals, firms, and nonprofits do to help close the racial inequality gap? Well, first, let's just think about the government. Certainly, when we think about monetary policy, it's so important for the Federal Reserve to think about how its policies are impacting communities of color and making sure that it's focused on its dual mandate, not only low inflation, but also making sure that there's full employment, that everyone is being employed, including persons of color. There's also financial inclusion, making sure that governments implement laws that ensure that no one is left out, especially with respect to employment. Governments can also provide housing incentives and tax reforms that are beneficial for people to start building wealth. Um, Another idea is guaranteed income. Others are investing in building wealth. And then finally, providing laws such as salary history bans that that would enable people who would normally be excluded from being able to advocate for their own wages. Now, in terms of firms, there's internal work as well as external work that can be done. Internally, firms can make sure that they are supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. They can also ensure that they have diverse slates when they're hiring, making sure that they have retention initiatives to keep the best talent of color, and also reviewing firing plans and making sure that communities of color are not unduly harmed whenever there's reduction in staffing. And then externally, businesses can think about corporate social responsibility, investing in your community, and then also making sure that you're developing metrics and tracking to see whether or not you are actually meeting those goals. And then most importantly, well, also importantly, is adding Black board members, not just one, but many, to have that voice in terms of advising companies on how best to make sure that they are addressing their DE&I initiatives both internally as well as externally. Thinking about individuals, well, before we go there, just thinking about nonprofits, nonprofits can partner with firms, partner with individuals, partner with communities, and partner with governments, as well as educate and advocate in terms of closing these racial economic gaps. And then finally, what can individuals do? Well, there's a variety of things that individuals and persons can do. First of all, education, making sure that you're educating yourself in financial literacy. Um, Deferred gratification, that means investing not only in yourself, but in your financial well-being. And then there's embracing risk. Many of us may have insurance, but it's important to also invest in stocks and bonds and commodities and other types of assets and housing that build wealth over time. Also advocating for yourself, especially on the job, making sure that you're asking for bigger responsibilities, a stretch assignment, the international assignment, uh, more advanced activities, whatever it is, make sure that you're speaking up for yourself. Also, be mobile, be willing to move around the country, move around the world, or just move positions, move jobs, change careers, do things that will allow you to be able to increase your knowledge as well as your income so that you can build wealth. And then finally, flex your political power in your communities at the ballot box. Make sure that your voice is being heard. So again, these racial inequality gaps are very costly, costing the US economy and all of us roughly $16 trillion over a 20-year period. However, if we close these gaps, we could generate so much growth that would benefit not only Black Americans, but all Americans. Thank you so much for your time.